Book review time. Just before the Christmas, I went to the local library and I just caught it by the corner of my eye. It's a book by Michael Heney. It's called The Arms Crisis of 1970. And this was a political turning event in Irish politics. And this book, it was published in 2020. It's the third such book on this particular situation, and the reason being the state is slowly dripping out the information that was held confidential way back in the 1960s. It's a pig of a read. It's like 400 pages long. It was very complicated. But I'm so grateful that I read this particular book, the times that we're in, on account of the fact that it has resonance with what's happening in Gaza. It puts into perspective refugees in the north of Ireland, Ukrainian refugees. It puts into perspective the armies, how they plan and try to work around particular political situations. It also shows how politics gets involved with it. Um, dare I say, corruption of politics, legal justice, the importance of record keeping, because a lot of the records that are in this book, a lot of the information that's contained in this book happened to be redacted way back in the 60s. It's in a way, like, you could say power corrupts and power corrupts absolutely. But if there is corruption in this, why do they have such extensive notes? And who wrote those notes, and who read those notes, and who redacted those notes? It's on a record somewhere, and it's only that the truth will come out in the end. So where do I go from here? Usually I go through it chapter by chapter, but I have a timeline here, and that's where I like to work from. So it starts off: key dates and events. 13th of August 1969, Northern Ireland report erupts after apprentice boys march with shootings, killings, and Catholic families burned from their homes. Jack Lynch, the Taoiseach at the time, delivers his "We cannot stand by" speech on television. After a government meeting, the Irish Army is deployed to the border. Now, since year dot, Northern Ireland is the first colony of the British Empire. Hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, English settlers, Scottish settlers were encouraged to come across into Ulster and plant Ulster. And in order for them to come in, they had to push the natives out. And for hundreds of years, loyalists have been pushing native Irish out of their lands since the beginning. And now, in fairness to the Northern Ireland people of Northern Ireland, the vast majority are enterprising, hardworking, law-abiding, religious. They might be stubborn in their views, but they will always carry the fact that they are oppressing the native people, just like the Israelis are doing in Gaza. No matter how good Northern Ireland is, there will always have that underlying issue that will never go away. It'll always be there, and it needs to be reconciled before any of us can move on from it. So when you think about it, back in 1921, the partition of Ireland, that was carte blanche to the loyalists to continue on pushing native Irish off the land, continue their push programs, they call them. The Jews have other words for it, but that's the way it was. And from the 20s right up to the 60s, native Irish people in those lands were forced off them through aggression, and in the 60s, they had the start of the civil rights marches. And in this particular one in 69, it was in Derry or Londonderry. What was happening was the civil rights movements, they'd start their march. There would be a loyalist march to counteract that particular march, just like what happens in Hong Kong. And of course, then the RUC would get involved, and the RUC would consistently fall on the side of the loyalists. And as a result of that, they got particularly heavy in Londonderry in 69. And as a result, there was 7 days of rioting, there was burnings, families were being evicted out of their houses, refugees, and killing. And it was very scary at the time, I can imagine. So the Irish government, Fianna Fáil it was led by Jack Lynch. He's the Taoiseach, he's a moderate, he's from Cork. He was what we call a dove. He wanted to see a peaceful resolution to the Northern Ireland question. However, in his cabinet, we'll get on to that later on. 14th to 16th of August, right? Refugees are begin to stream across the border. The Irish government hold a further series of crisis meetings to determine the response of the northern unrest, as fears remain of further sectarian assaults. The government makes contingency plans and decides that a sum of money will be provided for northern relief. Now, that sum of money, that fund that was set up, there was something like £300,000. It was entrusted on the then Minister for Finance, that was Charles J. Haughey, and further during those meetings, the Fianna Fáil cabinet was made up of hawks and doves. The hawks being the people who wanted a military solution to it. The likes of Charles Haughey was a hawk, Gibbons was a hawk, and Blaney from Donegal, he was a hawk as well. And on the other side, you had Lynch, who was a dove, and basically his view was the same as the previous Taoiseach, which was Lemass. Their view, the same with De Valera, questionably, was a peaceful resolution. So what kind of plans were they drawing up? Well, they took a brief to the army, and the Army Planning Board had to come up with military solutions. So military solution plan A was to go in and liberate Northern Ireland. Straight away, that was struck off the books. It was simply not feasible. The Irish Army compared to the British Army, bear in mind the British Army was in the midst of the Cold War. They were at the height of weapons production and weapons technology. If a British Army chieftain tank was to roll across the border, there would have been nothing to stop it. If a Harrier was to come over the horizon with Stinger missiles, there was nothing the Irish government could do or the army could do about it. So plan A, no. Plan B was to plead to the United Nations to bring in a policing action, much the likes, when you consider it, the Irish Army's experience of that was Jadoville and the Congo. Not very positive situations there. They weren't in Lebanon at the time, I don't think, but that experience of having the UN to get involved with it, again, it didn't sound feasible. It didn't look like it was going to work. Plan C was mercy missions, to send in, was to go in and try to relieve what was going on, to go in and actually help out with the defence of native Irish people who are being attacked by the loyalists. That was going to be a very difficult situation, because it would be very difficult to explain that to the British government. Of course, at the time, the Irish foreign relations got in contact with the British government. The British government's view was it was nothing to do with the Republic. It was an internal affair. The British government were going to handle it. They were going to send in the British Army. They basically told the Irish no. And as a consequence of that, the Irish Army or the Irish government could not really sit by. So they started making their own plans, as any other country would do. And Plan C, like I said before, was to actually go in and relieve and supply those defences, those communities with rifles. But the problem was they had only standard registered Irish arms, and again, that would have been a no-no. Politically, it wouldn't have worked out. Furthermore, there was another option, but we'll come to that later. 20th of September, Lynch delivers a policy speech in Northern Ireland in Tralee, County Kerry, setting out a peaceful approach to ending partition. Okay, so Jack Lynch was basically putting up the message out that it really should be a peaceful approach. 3rd to 4th of October 69, a meeting of Northern Defence Committees in Ballybor, County Cavan, convened by Captain James Kelly, the beginning of a plan to import arms. This was Plan D. Captain James Kelly, he was Army intelligence, and he happened to be on holiday in Northern Ireland during the time of 69. He saw what was happening. He reported back to his superior, who was Colonel Heffernan, and the colonel was head of Army intelligence at the time, and Heffernan encouraged Kelly to go back into Ireland, into Northern Ireland, see what kind of people were out there, and what way could the army have helped. Now Kelly came back, and what they had in Northern Ireland were called Northern Defence Committees, and they ranged from committees that were all about just the defence of that particular community to keep, because at the time the loyalists had the guns, and the non-native or the Irish did not have any access to guns, right? So at one end they wanted guns to defend themselves from what was going on, but at the other end you had the IRA, which was Goulding's IRA, which was communist leaning. They didn't actually recognize the Republican government at the time, and they wanted a complete solution, which was a 32 county communist in thing. So you had on one side, at one extreme, you had favorable groups out there, but you also had very less favorable groups out there as well. Also in this, James Kelly met John Kelly. John Kelly was IRA. He is IRA, and he was more. He did not want the communist type IRA that Goulding was promoting. He wanted just a provisional IRA, and he was instrumental in setting up the provisional IRA, as I understand it. So there, James Kelly was reporting back to Heffernan. Colonel Heffernan was reporting these details back to Minister of Defence, what's his name? Gibbons. So anyways, 6th of February 1970, all right, the Minister for Defence, James Gibbons, delivers a government directive to the Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces. He orders him to prepare for possible military intervention by the Irish Army across the border into Northern Ireland. At the time, the Irish Army were purchasing heavy artillery, heavy mortars, and when you think about it, it was coincidental on the part of the army that they were purchasing them. They weren't specifically purchasing that weaponry for the invasion of Northern Ireland. When you think about it, towed military or towed artillery and heavy mortars, they're kind of low in the military budget. Like, you know, if you wanted to invade Northern Ireland properly, you'd want to be investing in main battle tanks, heavy jets, heavy bombs, even self-propelled artillery, that sort of stuff. But at the time, the army was purchasing artillery, and again, it's accurate stuff, but it's not the kind of stuff that you need for an incursion into Northern Ireland at the time. So that was going on at the time, but what Minister Gibbons was trying to get the army to do as well was the setup of military hospitals along the border, so that they could look after the refugees as they cross the border. The fund that I mentioned before, that was supposed to help those refugees, give them relief. So in terms of also there was also plans being drawn up on Plan C, which was the supplying of weapons into Northern Ireland. It was a non-runner, but the army had to have that solution on standby just in case it ever escalated to that situation. But what the army did not know, that was the army's chief of staff. That wasn't Colonel Heffernan. But what the army didn't know was the fact that James Kelly was looking into the more clandestine operation of importing arms into Ireland at the time. But March, Captain James Kelly visited the continent several times in an effort to acquire arms for the Northern Defence Committees. It was now, according to James Kelly, he was operating under the instruction of the Minister of Defence, and as such, it was a clandestine operation. It was very few people would actually know about it, but what we do know was, we'll come to that later, but the fact was Captain James Kelly, pretty new to this whole idea, pretty new to actually the actual physical logistics of moving arms from Europe into Ireland, and all the red tape that was there was his undoing, because we'll see later on, 2nd of April 1970, army lorries loaded with weapons and ammunition are sent as far north as Dundalk Army Barracks, as rioting and disturbances in Ballymurphy and Belfast threatened to get out of hand. There you go, was Plan C, right? It wasn't supposed to happen, but the order went out and those weapons were moved close to the border. Did they actually cross the border? No, they didn't. So it was under control at the time. It was Plan C. It was never. It would not have happened. It would only have happened if everything went to shit. And at the time, the Irish government was not involved in Northern Ireland at the time physically. 18th of April, with an arms consignment expected at Dublin Airport over the weekend, the Garda Special Branch mount a blockade around the airport. When Charles Haughey telephones Department of Justice Secretary Peter Berry and asks for the incoming consignment to be allowed through unhindered, Berry refuses. Who is Berry? Peter Berry is the head of Garda Special Branch. He would have been on the same line as Colonel Heffernan. Now, Colonel Heffernan and Berry do meet from time to time, but Garda operations would be completely separate from army operations. Now, what was happening was James Kelly tried to get those arms in through the ports. It didn't work out. That started raising alarm bells in customs. Customs passed that information on to Special Branch, and the guards were watching what was going on. They found out basically that there was a consignment, that there was a plane loaded with weapons due to leave Berlin and enter into Dublin Airport. So now, according to the book, James Kelly contacted customs ahead of that flight to say, was there any red tape or anything that he had to sign off on in order for those arms to come through. Customs then passed that information on to Garda Special Branch. Garda Special Branch swooped and they ring-fenced the airport. They were waiting for that plane to land so they would go in, confiscate that and arrest anybody involved with that illegal shipment of arms. But Kelly contacted, now it's not, it wasn't clear in the book, and I'm only getting this off a documentary that I saw. Primetime Investigates did one on it, on James Kelly's position on this whole issue, and apparently James was contacted our Minister for Defence, James Gibbons, contacted Charles Haughey. The reason that he contacted Charles Haughey was because Peter Berry had worked with Charles Haughey previously. They knew each other. They had a relationship. So it would have been more important if Charles Haughey was to contact Berry directly and say, "Look, this is going to happen on the sly. Let this go." Peter was having none of it. Okay, the flight never arrived. What happened was Charles Haughey rang Berry. He says, "There's a consignment of arms coming into Dublin Airport. What do you intend to do with it?" And Berry told him exactly what he was going to do with it. Haughey then was on record as saying, "Well, I better cancel it so." And there was a bit of a discussion as to that the arms were not going to stay in the island of Ireland. They were going to be translated to Northern Ireland as well, as per a recorded call. But in the end, Charles Haughey cancelled it. And so the flight never took off from Berlin. It never arrived into Dublin Airport. That was the 18th of April. The 20th of April, Taoiseach Jack Lynch receives a Garda report from Peter Berry setting out details of the unsuccessful attempt to import arms covertly into Dublin Airport on the previous weekend. 20th of April, 21st of April, 22nd of April, 23rd of April, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th, 31, 1st of May, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th of May. Leader of Fine Gael, Liam Cosgrave, confronts Lynch with an anonymous leaked document on Garda-headed notepaper. This alleges that cabinet ministers were involved in an illegal effort to bring in guns for Northerners. Make what you will of that. 6th of May, the very next day, Lynch sacks Minister Charles Haughey and Neil Blaney at 2 a.m. in the morning for their involvement in the attempted gun running. Other ministers resign in protest. On the 9th of May, a marathon confidence debate takes place in Dáil Éireann after Jack Lynch reforms his government. Lynch wins the vote. So he reformed his cabinet. He no longer had his Minister for Finance. Did he have Gibbons was there? I'm not sure. I think Gibbons was still there, acting Minister of Defence. I believe he was, yeah. 27th, 28th of May, criminal charges are issued by the Attorney General against Charles Haughey, Neil Blaney, Captain James Kelly, John Kelly, and Albert Loix, who was a Belgian who was the interpreter for James Kelly when he was abroad on his dealings. Now, the guards then went and took statements off those guys, and they also took statements of Colonel Heffernan and who's a Paddy Bogside as well, and John Kelly. John Kelly was listed there. So the guards went in and they did their own investigation on what had actually happened. Those statements were then collected, and they would have been put in what's called the Book of Evidence. As it happens, who had charge of that Book of Evidence and what happened then was up for debate and very quiet. And at the time, nobody was aware of anything untoward at that time. 2nd of July, charges are withdrawn against Neil Blaney at a preliminary hearing in Dublin District Court. Okay, Neil Blaney was a politician for Northern Ireland. His involvement with this particular scheme was that he knew a lot of Northern Defence Committee members operating in Northern Ireland, and he was what you call the Northern voice, and he would have had his finger on the pulse of what was going on along the border. But they couldn't find anything on him with regards to the actual attempted gun running plot, so he was withdrawn. 22nd to the 29th of September, the first arms trial takes place at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin under Judge Aindris O'Keefe. It collapses when O'Keefe suddenly withdraws. Now, what had happened there was the judge was accused of being prejudiced towards one of the members one of the accused, and he simply just walked out, and the case collapsed, or the court collapsed. So they tried again a month later, the 6th to the 23rd of October. Second arms trial takes place under Judge James Heney. All 4 accused are acquitted by jury. And that's a very short little excerpt, but it was a very, very long chapter. Michael Heney, you don't do this particular bit much credit, because in this, Colonel Heffernan was acting for the prosecution. He was their key player, and Colonel Heffernan had supplied the guards with a statement of everything that had happened. Now, bear in mind, Colonel Heffernan is an outstanding soldier. He did everything by the book. He wasn't political. He was servant. He did exactly what he was ordered to do. And if anybody was going to tell the truth, he did. Now, what had happened was, his statement was put out, and even prosecution was in disarray on account of the fact that it didn't do certain things. And I wouldn't go into it in this podcast on account of the fact that, I don't like the idea of naming names and the history that's there. But I would recommend that if you do want to see how things worked back in the 60s, if you look up Colonel Heffern's statement, the one that was produced at the trial and the one that was released 30 years later in state papers, big difference. And again, I suppose it reflects the sensitivity at the situation, but it also had consequences, long political consequences, for this country and for the refugees in Northern Ireland. November 1971, evidence is taken at inquiry hearings conducted by the Dáil Committee of Public. All 4 accused are acquitted by jury. They were let go. There was no arms imported at the end of the day. Charles Haughey basically says, when he was questioned about his conversation with Peter Barry, he basically said, I didn't know that there was arms in that. There was nothing to do with me. I was just acting on doing my job for the army. He kind of fobbed it off. And out of the 4 of them, I'll continue on. Evidence is taken at inquiry hearings conducted by the Dáil Committee of Public Accounts. They basically wanted to see, was the money that was the fund, the 300,000, was that actually spent properly? And the Committee of Public Accounts released its inquiry report. It found almost 35,000 had been misappropriated, spent for purposes other than what it termed as relief of distress. In other words, was it money that was spent on arms? Nobody will really know, but most likely. And 35,000 would have been the smaller figure. Money was spent. What I got from the acquittal of the 4 accused, Charles Haughey, as a consequence of this political furore, it showed him up to be, he had the smell of cordite on him. So, that rang well with his supporters. And as a result, he lost his position as Minister for Finance, but he did stick around in Fianna Fáil. And when Jack Lynch came to his term in office, Charles Haughey succeeded him as Taoiseach. Who else? James Gibbons wasn't involved with it. Just get back to the Taoiseach Jack Lynch. Before the whole arms trial debacle, Jack Lynch was seen as a mild-mannered, moderate. He was having difficulty keeping Haughey, who was ambitious, and Blaney, who was outspoken, trying to keep those big characters under control in his cabinet. It was seen that he was losing the battle. Now, after the trial, he had dismissed Blaney. He had dismissed, or he sacked Haughey and Blaney, and suddenly he became this incredibly strong leader, and he was very decisive, and he went on to have majority um, um, votes of confidence over the next 10 years of his political life, of his term in office. It, had there been no arms trial whatsoever, Jack Lynch would have continued on as moderate, and it would have meant that the Irish government really weren't going to address the issues in the north. By having this arms trial, or having this big political scandal blow up, it meant that it took the attention off what was happening in Northern Ireland for a while, and it looked at the Irish government and how were they going to resolve the Northern Ireland question. And in the end, what it looked like was that the Irish government wouldn't have had any power to do anything in Northern Ireland at the time. The truth of it would have been, but they wanted to show that they were trying. I think they were trying, and as a consequence of that, Fianna Fáil went on to stay in power for. After Haughey, there was Bertie Ahern, and further on. Again, it just shows politics, and the cut and thrust of politics. Is it corruption? If it was corruption, then why was there such an evidence trail? Okay, take it what it is. It's like if the information came out at the time, if the full truth came out at the time, not only would the Northern Ireland situation in Northern Ireland would have been, it wasn't going to change one way or the other, and it would have shown the Irish government as being impotent, just unable to do anything and just watch what was happening. And the danger there was that the defence committees were forming. The IRA had formed. Sinn Féin were gaining traction in the north, and the fear was that if Sinn Féin managed to pull it off, if the IRA managed to, much like the Mujahideen had done to the Russians in Afghanistan, if they managed to miraculously pull off pushing the British Empire out of Northern Ireland, then Sinn Féin would have had the power to sweep into Republic of Ireland, sweep away the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael governments, and show absolute, and the risk would have been, it could have been, Sinn Féin could have turned communist, because at the time the IRA had under Goulding was communist in thing. So the politics of it, again, that's the thing about democracy. There's never a clear cut answer to it. It's always complicated. At one stage, I was furious to see how the government were trying to hide and try to make little, and how they outdid. For example, I forgot to mention James Kelly as a captain. He during the arms crisis, while he was running, while he was working on the running of the guns, he was advised to resign from the army, which he had done. However, after he was acquitted in the trials, he was no longer an army officer, but he was. I wouldn't say was he disgraced. Wouldn't have been the word that would have been put on him, but there was definitely a black mark put on him for what he had done, and his what he had done, and he had basically done what he was ordered to do, tried to make the best of it as best he could. And for the following 20, 30 years after the arms trial, he'd been working to, clear his name. And on account of the fact of Colonel Heffern's statement being so badly redacted, that guy, his career was his career was over. He ended up going back to Cavan and tried to live a quiet life. Same again for Colonel Heffern. He thought the truth was going to come out at the time, or maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but he did spend years, decades after the arms trials, trying to clear his name. And that Primetime Investigates report, it was his son that they were interviewing about the long version of his statement, and it just goes to show that had he been alive to see the truth finally coming out about his statement, would things have been different? At the time, he was retiring as head of Army Intelligence, and he was being succeeded by Delaney, Colonel Delaney, I can't say, but Delaney was highly critical of his Heffern and his handling of the intelligence of that period. So for the likes of Peter Berry as well, he was an outstanding civil servant. He did his job, and he followed it to the letter. And again, his name was tarnished as well for his involvement with it. And it's painful to see that some of the best and brightest minds in the country, in terms of the civil service, and to find themselves in that particular situation is very difficult to digest. Furthermore, we do. So you have to either love Haughey or hate him. But the reality of it is politics is, when you get involved with it, you can't bring your emotions into it. You have to be intelligent with the information that's being brought to you. And if indeed, when those statements in the book of evidence had been redacted, it was done in the national interests. The fact that it fell in line with helping keeping Fianna Fáil in power over the 20 years, was that a coincidence or a consequence of that? History. Again, probably in 10 years' time, you'll probably see another edition of what happened in the arms crisis. But it's worth following. That's all I have tonight. Take care.